This isn't a joke. Back in 2013, a very talented programmer named Chris Spry created a homebrew Super Mario Bros. Port for the Atari 2600. Let's take a look. The very first thing to say is that Princess Rescue is an amazing technical achievement considering the hardware. While it's usually associated with the 1980s, the Atari 2600 actually came out in 1977, long before modern console design concepts were even invented. There's no frame buffer, the CPU only runs at 1.19 MHz, and the system only has 128 bytes. Not megs or anything, but individual bytes of RAM. Now, I'm not going into some exhaustive retrospective on the 2600, but just keep in mind the extreme hardware limitations as we take a closer look at this game. On its surface, Princess Rescue is exactly what it appears to be. It's a homebrew clone of Super Mario Bros. These projects, where someone takes a more modern game and makes a version for an older console, are often called demakes as opposed to a remake. There's a fan community for this stuff, and it's out there. The game was originally published and released on physical cartridges by Atari Age, but Nintendo sent a cease and desist letter to them, and the game is no longer available for purchase as a result. A cartridge from the original run does occasionally show up on eBay, but they tend to go for hundreds of dollars, and they're now basically collector's items. Thankfully, the ROM image is available for free from the original source, since it seems that Nintendo only asked them to stop selling the commercial cartridge. I'm using the Stella emulator to capture this footage. The game is a fairly faithful port with most of the gameplay mechanics you might expect to find. Power-ups, Fire Mario, bouncing off enemies, coin blocks, going down pipes, clearing flagpoles to end the level, and familiar enemies, and stomping on them. Princess Rescue is hard. Like, no joke, this is a tough game. But most of the difficulty is somewhat artificial. There are a few cheap deaths, blind jumps, and, enemies that spawn right at the edge of the screen into your line of movement, but generally, you're fighting the controls, and this is a result of some hardware caveats that would take a long time to go into. The game is compatible with a Sega Genesis controller if you're playing this on original hardware. And if you didn't know this, yes, Sega controllers will work on the 2600. And Atari 2600 Junior was my first game console, and I actually had a Sega Master System controller that I found at a flea market for $1. I was shocked that it actually worked. Anyway, the original Atari controller only had one button, so if you aren't using a Genesis pad, you have to hit up on the joystick to get the functions that you might expect out of the B button, running and shooting. I think this is a pretty creative way to get around the controller limitations, but it can be really clunky, and it makes precision jumps quite difficult. In the footage I'm showing, I was actually trying. There are no intentional deaths and no intentional slips, and I'm not just abjectly terrible at 2D platformers. It's just really difficult to do tight jumps. I'm using a USB adapter to plug a Super Nintendo pad into my PC, and that's one of the best controllers ever made, and I'm still having problems. Anyway, the level design is surprisingly good for a homebrew game. Some of the elements are very obviously borrowed from Super Mario Bros. Games, and there's even a shell kick obstacle in one of the levels, and that one gave me a grin. The yellow blocks will randomly contain power-ups, and I suspect this was a restriction of the hardware rather than an intentional choice by the developer, and that means that the power-ups are not always in the same place in the levels when you replay them. This has an unintended side effect of giving the game a little bit of replayability. So if you game over, and you will, you can continue from the start of the world you died on. So if you were on level 3-3, you can start over on 3-1 if you game over. The sound is, well, the 2600 had one of the worst sound chips of any video game console ever produced, so the sound and music are simplistic at best. Sacrifices were made to fit the hardware constraints, and it shows. For context, the entire game is only 32 kilobytes. This picture of the cartridge is a larger file than the ROM image for the full game. Think about that for a moment. As someone who's done a bit of hobbyist-level software development and game programming, I'm simply amazed that this fit into such a small file size. Overall, this is really an impressive game, considering the context and the limitations of the hardware, and my hat goes off to Chris Spry for making this work. The Atari 2600 has a surprisingly vibrant homebrew community, and this is, hands down, the best homebrew I've ever played for the 2600, and I've tried out quite a few. The 2600 was known for a huge amount of shovelware titles. The vast majority of the console's library are, frankly, horrible games, even by early 1980s standards. Princess Rescue stands out from the huge inventory of single-screen arcade blast-its and maze games. The fun factor is iffy, and frankly, it's more interesting from the technical angle than the entertainment angle. But within the context of the 2600 library, this really is a rare gem. If you're at all interested in the 2600, homebrew projects, or just want to check out a really weird oddity of retro gaming, give Princess Rescue a shot. You probably won't be coming back to this game to play it more than once or twice unless you're a diehard 2600 enthusiast, but if you're into this sort of thing, it's worth a look. However, if retro gaming really isn't your deal, you probably won't find anything of interest here. As always, thanks for watching.